Dear students, today's lecture is about body art and performance art. This is a completely new field of art, of the visual arts, a new art form, you might say, that developed mostly in the 1960s and 1970s, and which by now is a standard and widely recognized part of the visual arts. In order to understand it and its origins, I've brought you an example here from Katsuwa Shiraga, making a work with his own body, which is quite early, from 1955, and shows the artist rolling in mud using the only material for this work, which is mud. So you see, this is very interesting. This is an artist making a work as if he were standing in front of a canvas with a brush, or as if he were working with clay, for example, but he is using his entire body, rolling on the ground. There is a large amount of physical action, and he's working the ground with his whole body, as opposed to working a small bit of clay or stone or whatever with his hands and instruments, and as opposed to using a printing press or a brush or a pen or whatever. So, in the first instance, body art, performance art are the attempt to get away from the more traditional and classic formats of art. They are an attempt to get more physical and to get more involved with the world. I mean, how can you get more involved with the world than rolling on the ground, right? So, this is point one. The second point is, when you look at Shiraga's work here, you see that there is no real product. I mean, if you were a sculptor, which in a way he is, or a painter, which in a way he is, there would be, in the end, there would be something left. The action of art up to then was mostly a means of producing something. Of course, we have action painting, talked about that. We have the performative art and so on. But here, normally there would be physical action by the artist, which results in an object, which can then be sold, displayed, possessed. Whereas here, when you look at this, there is not really a product. We do not know where this mud side is, what it may look like now. Maybe there's a skyscraper on top by now. We don't know. So there is a shift in focus away from the object towards physical action in space. There's also a shift away from producing commercially usable objects, from art as a commodity, towards art as an action in space. Interesting, right? So this is more process-oriented. This is not so much about results. There was a very, very fundamental shift, and even today, it can be really interesting to look at art and decide whether it is more process-oriented or whether it is more result-oriented. It tells you things about the work you're looking at. Performance art, as the name already says, is closely related to the performative arts. Please do not mix these up. The performative arts, theater, later on the movies, moving images, all kinds of time-based media, video installations, but originally music and the theater, are the arts that are defined by the fact that they unfold in time. They are based in time. That is the definition given by Gotthold Ephraim Lessing in 1766 in his seminal essay Laocoon. And he was one of the brightest minds of his century, and it's still a valid definition. So, performative arts based in time, which implies that the visual arts, as opposed to performative arts, are kind of timeless. Of course they are not. I mean, of course, every art object has its lifespan. It can get damaged, it changes over time, the material changes over time. Of course, if the visual arts weren't bound to time, there would be no need for restoration ever. Yeah, nothing could ever go wrong or amiss. But the point is that they don't need time to unfold in the sense that a theater piece does. And actually, Lessing links with Foucault on that one. Foucault claiming that every portrait is a murder. Why does he say that? Why can Foucault in the 20th century, late 20th century, 220 years later after Lessing claim that a portrait is a murder? Because a portrait tries to stop time. Because a portrait tries to stop its subject in time, to preserve a person and a person's appearance and character at a certain moment in their life, to stop it. And of course, Foucault implies that development is the mark of life, development and change. And if you stop this, if you just concentrate on one fixed moment, it is it is like killing someone. So, and of course, this is what a lot of the visual arts are about. They are attempts at stopping time traditionally, attempts at transcending time. It is very natural. It is fighting the human condition, the problem of time, the tragedy of time slipping away, the impossibility of going back to a moment that is past, the impossibility of anticipating the moments in the future. And we all try to stop time sometimes. I mean, even in such small practices as, you're living through a wonderful moment and then you reach for your mobile phone and you make a quick photograph because you don't want this moment to pass. You want to preserve it. And that is the attempt of the visual arts, of the still image, to stop time. So, and body art and performance art bring back time into the visual arts, which makes sense, right? If you try to get rid of the kind of stuffiness that goes with the traditional art forms, if you say, okay, all these precious, valuable pieces in the museums, all these very valuable items in the white painted gallery, abstract art that is only for rich people and has nothing to do with real life. We need something else. If you say we need something else than that, it makes sense to have something that is not precious, that is not valuable, that is raw and alive, and that is affected by time. But most of all, that is physical. And maybe, even though most of the performance art, the start of performance art is before Foucault wrote this, the impulse may be similar. In the 60s, and in Japan, even earlier, in Japan in the 50s, there is this urge to get away from the non-moving, precious, commercially valuable and silent visual arts, to get into new forms, into something more physical, more active, something that is more in touch with real life and that is violent, immediate, that involves the spectators directly, which is not something that is not about contemplation. You must remember, 1950s, after the Second World War, in large parts of the world, that is a time, and 1960s too, of course, that is a time when abstract art was considered the gold standard of the visual arts. And abstract art, as you have seen, in many ways is about formal problems. Abstract art is about shapes, composition, proportions, color, and contemplation. It is very far removed from daily problems and daily life, and it is meant to be. And of course, we need art that takes us out of our daily lives, of our worries, of, yes, the dirty concerns of the stuff we have to deal with on a daily basis. That is important. It is important. Because it is so easy to get lost in that kind of thing. Of course, it is equally important to have politically engaged art, to have art that is exactly about this kind of thing, that helps us see and deal with the daily violence, the pressure we're under, the physical aspect of our lives. Because, of course, abstract art is supremely non-physical. These are just two extremes of art, and we need them both. I remember a very nice moment from when I was a tour guide at the New National Gallery in Berlin. I often had school kids, and I remember that was a remarkable group. I think they came from the international school in Cairo. And we were standing in front of one of those canvases by Lucio Fontana, which are just a white canvas with a slash in it, which are normally very hard to explain to kids because, of course, kids are steeped in narratives, and it's much easier for them to grasp a story than an abstract concept. And we were standing there, and I said, so what do you think this is all about? And then one of these kids, you know, maybe 8 years old or so, he says, I think this is about infinity. And I said, okay, that's it, yeah, perfect. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, I enjoyed it so much because there's so many grown-ups who find it difficult to come to terms with Lucio Fontana because they're also technically oriented, you know, because they say, what does it take, what kind of skill does it take to take a knife and slash a canvas? Say, yeah, well, manually, maybe not so much. But in terms of artistic concept and idea, you need to work for a long time until you can arrive at a concept like that. So, abstract. Yes. Now imagine, as I said, 1950s, 1960s, the gold standard in the Western world for the visual arts is abstract art. However, who are the young artists at that time? Who is 20 in 1960? These are kids who were born in the 1940s, who were born into the war or right after the war. And they were not content with contemplating non-political art in a formal space, in a white cube, in what we would call today a kind of calming environment. I don't really know the English technical term for it. What you need when you have burnout, you know, a space where there is nothing that goes on your nerves. Instead, they needed to act out their inner tension. There was by the 70s, by the late 60s, there was a war going on in the US, the Vietnam War, which a lot of people agreed was not, especially the young people agreed, was not a smart idea. A lot of young people died there. A lot of young people refused to go and die there. A lot of young people went there and killed people of another color just for geopolitical reasons, and this was all very far removed from you know, fighting racist, fascist mass murderers as their fathers had done and their mothers also in the Second World War. This is the situation in the US. However, and performative body and performance art are largely associated with the US. However, I've brought you my first example, Shiraga, because this is much earlier and this is from Japan. And actually, the main impulses for body and performance art in the 60s came from Japan, with deep roots in expressive Japanese theater like Budo. And of course, Japan, like Germany, was a country where once the children of the war had grown up, there was so much to be, there was so much that could not be discussed, that had to be acted out on a different level. And in many ways, I find it logical that the beginnings of body art go back to Japan. Because as a German, I still know that from my parents, or from the same generation as many of the body and performance artists, there's so much stuff they never talked about, stuff that happened to them as kids, and which comes out in very weird ways sometimes, in sickness or in moments when they speak to other people. Well, very interesting. What I am saying is, Japan had lost a war, and like Germany, it had also lost its ideological center. Better, better to get rid of the racist and dangerous military ideology that had ruled those countries. However, there is you must realize there was also so much that could not be talked about. Japan, Tokyo burned to the ground. They had the 2 atomic bombs were thrown onto that island. All the things that happened, all these victims that could not be officially mourned, all these things that could not be openly talked about, because the war was lost, because parents had been fascists, because culture had completely changed, and also the link between the generations was broken somehow by the failure of the older generation to protect their children, because they had fallen for a military ideology that had destroyed their countries. And if you think of this in terms of the body, these are things, war is something that acts on the body. Violence that comes, that is the very definition of war, acts on the body. Violence in families, that is often the consequence of war and of trauma, acts on the body. Trauma acts on the body. So in many ways, it makes sense that this is the generation that was simply not content with formal problems being contemplated by abstract artists, just as Judd or Albers or Morris, or all the even Lee Krasner and the action painters, right? So maybe this is probably one of the big impulses. There was this necessity to act out the pressure, to address problems, political problems, societal problems in a new way. And that was body art and performance art. Of course, we've had physical experiments, performative experiments situated somewhere between theater, music, and the visual arts before. Always, forever. And the roots of 20th century body art and performance art some of the roots are definitely to be located with Dada and Surrealism, and with artists like Elsa Freitag von Loringhofen, the northern German artist who lived in the US in the 1910s and 20s, and who is probably the original author of the urinal for which Duchamp is so famous. But this is another story that we should tell another time. So, what is all this about? Physical action, violence, acting in space, something raw, alive, immediate, something that physically involves also often the spectators, and a new art form that offers the possibility to be linked to daily life, or also to politics, or just, also an art form that is about archetypal constellations, but however that is outside the museum, that is in nature, that takes place in community centers, in the streets, in theaters, in small galleries, wherever. But that is outside the white cube, and that is not about contemplation, but about action, acting out. I've brought you another example after the Shiraga, which I'm very fond of. Here's a vegetarian's nightmare. This is a documentary photograph from a Carolee Schneemann performance from 1964, which was called Meat Joy, and I've brought it for its physicality. You see that the materials used in this performance were raw fish, sausages, chickens, wet paint, plastic, rope, paper scrap. And as you see, it happened in Judson Church. So not in a gallery space, not in a museum, but in an alternative space, and amazingly in a church. And of course, this is also where we find historical roots of performance art, of body art, and of the theater. Because of course, before the theater, we have religious ritual. And this is something that many performance artists were and are very much aware of, that their art form goes back to religious ritual, which also very often are a way of physically and symbolically negotiating societal and human problems, concerns. Actually, that's a bit small. The human condition, negotiating the human condition, the fact that we have to die, we don't know when, and which a lot of religion is all about. And of course, as a body artist, it makes sense to see like Christian ritual, which is supposed to be the transformation of bread into flesh and of wine into blood. I mean, how much more physical can you get? I mean, that is body art, that is performance art. And so here we have Meat Joy in a church in New York City by Carolee Schneemann, and you see that was a very, very physical affair, and gives you a good impression of what was going on then. And here you also see another aspect typical for body art and performance art, an aspect which it has in common, for example, with land art. It is something that happens in the moment or in far remote places, and that is accessible to a larger public only in a documented form. That is mostly photographs. It was much harder in the 60s than it is now to come up with a video camera, and sometimes people even didn't feel the necessity to film because it was about the immediate moment, about what was happening. It was not about preserves. So what we know about performances now is what is left is very often photographs, sometimes video, and that led up to very interesting experiments like those in socialist Poland, where artists who knew they were under surveillance from the Secret Service as artists of the opposition, and they knew they were being documented, they actually started performing for the surveillance cameras. And there is also a lot of, performance art from the so-called Eastern Bloc, which is, which everybody thought had never been documented. But when, after the wall came down, when the archives were opened, it turned out there was a lot of documentary material from the secret services. So at least they were good for something. Another example I've brought you is Italian artist Gina Parnet. She started in 1970. She did a lot of performances, mostly dressed in white, and her main feature, what she's known for, is self-hurt, self-inflicted wounds. She would hurt herself with razor blades, rose thorns, fire, name it, you'll have it. And normally, when I show photographs such as this from Gina Parnet's work, there are very strong reactions from the student body, like, why does she do this? Or, this is disgusting. Or, I once had somebody who said, was she married? So, my answer to that one was that Gina Parnet is doing publicly what about 20% of... My answer to this was that Gina Parnet was doing publicly what between maybe 5, sometimes even up to 10% of the population are doing in secret, because self-hurt, I mean, even as explicit self-hurt as cutting oneself, is quite common, a very common practice, especially among teenagers, not only female teenagers, also male, but mostly hurting themselves with cigarette butts and so on. It is a very common practice between a lot of young people, also older people, to turn psychological and emotional pressure into physical pain. It is something that you must be aware of. It's very, very present, however not visible in modern Western society. And Gina Parnet just, what she did was she just made it public in an aestheticized and ritualized way. Of course, I know someone who was present at one of her performances, and she was still angry 25 years later, and she said, "Why would that woman force me to watch that kind of thing?" And yes, I agree. Why would she force us to watch this? This is painful. And it creates neurological reactions. I mean, you cannot look at somebody cutting themselves and it affects you. You react to the hormones, to the pheromones. You react to her physical reaction. You have your own physical reaction. This is not nice. And that is what it's all about. It is not nice either that a lot of people, and a lot of young women especially, do hurt themselves in secret as a consequence of emotional distress and very often of violence and also sexual violence experienced in childhood. She just made it visible. And that is, again, here, we are interpreting a feminist artist as somebody who can tell us something about women. However, when you look at our society as a whole, there is so much violence going on. At that time, the destruction of the environment and the destruction of the other species was not yet such a big thing. They were not so aware of that. They just started to become aware of that. But just, everybody's memories of the war, or non-memories, the stuff they did not talk about, as I said. And the normal violence of everyday life, of everyday doing stuff you hate to do, of how people treat each other, of how people treat themselves. How many days are there where you and I hurt ourselves? Maybe not by cutting ourselves with our knives, but, eating badly, sleeping badly, quarreling, screaming at each other, hating our lives, hating ourselves. I mean, it happens all the time. And it is very often, it doesn't have so much to do with our personal decisions. It is just the structure of our society they are violent in many ways. And this is what this is all about. It's not about whether she was married or not. This is about making visible the violent structures of our society. And of course, these are also about the violence hidden in the dictate of beauty, which is especially and was especially valid for women at the time. Still, it's there. I've brought you also a male example of specifically male violence. This is Chris Burden. Chris Burden in his performance Shoot from 1971. That was a performance where he had a friend of his shoot him in the arm as a piece of art, an artwork in a gallery, people watching. So, sensationalist, of course, and sickening in many ways. And here you have him, you can see his eyes are widened in shock. You can see the gunshot wound. Of course, this could have gone wrong in so many ways. And of course, everybody was like, "Oh my God, Chris Burden, what an idiot he is." And yes, I agree. But this is 1971. Look at that young man. Do you know how many young men exactly like him were being shot at the very same moment. And just because it was a few thousand kilometers away in Southeast Asia, nobody minded it. It's basically, on a physical basis, same thing. People being shot at, and not just young men. I mean, we have GIs shooting at women and children at napalming villages at the same time in Southeast Asia. And then people get upset about Chris Burden doing the same thing at home in the US. It's a very, very smart and very consequent example of changing contexts. And here you see how the deeply troubling and fundamental experience of putting your life in danger is at the same time archetypal in a way. I mean, being attacked, being shot at is such a common experience of so many people, and especially men in the 20th century. Such a raw experience. And how this is kind of laid bare, but it is also political at the same time, very much so. Here's another work by Chris Burden, Transfixed, 1974. This is where he had himself nailed through his hands and feet to a Volkswagen. Of course, you see, this is a work that taps into Christian traditions. This is quoting the crucified Christ, and the cross in this instance is not a cross. It's not an antique torture device and device of execution. It is, in this instance, the machine of the modern age. The machine that is about mobility, that is about consumerism, that is about mechanical structures we get caught up in, and that is about modern life, the machine of modern life. And interestingly, I think this work has aged extremely well, because by now this machine of modern life has become climate killer number 2 after beef. So it is changing its significance, and it still works. As we can often observe in newly established fields in the art business, in the art world, in art making also, there often is a chance for women to leave their mark, because a new field hasn't been claimed yet, is uncharted territory, often doesn't bring a lot of money yet, and as long as there is pioneering work to be done, as long as the hierarchies in the field haven't been established, as long as it isn't commercialized yet, time and again we have seen that is the moment for women to step forward. We've seen that in photography with women like Margaret Cameron. We've seen that in the movies, and it is similar for performance art. We have a lot of very important performance artists, female performance artists in the 60s and 70s, far more than in, for example, in such traditional areas as painting, which doesn't mean that we have more women practicing this, but we have more women who manage to get attention and to be discussed and to leave their mark on art history. So the result of this is that also we have a lot of feminist approaches. Second wave feminism was strong in the 70s, and there is a large field of very, very strong feminist performance, and Carolee Schneemann is certainly part of that, such as are many others, and Gina Parnet also in a way. Yeah. I've brought you some more examples. One of my favorite examples is Vali Export, Austrian artist, still going strong nowadays with media art based and with a close connection to the body. This is her famous Tap and Tast kino, the touching cinema, where she exposed her breast in this homemade box, like a little wearable body extension theater piece and invited men in the public to touch her breasts in there while looking them in the eye. She was confronting everyday sexism, the everyday sexism of her time and of her country, head on. Yeah. Because, of course, you know what it's like. You know what it's like to walk into a workshop and there's always this pin-up on the wall. There are always female bodies on display for men to look at. And sometimes when you're a young woman and walk into this male-dominated territory, it can make you feel strange. It can make you wonder also somehow how they look at you. And Export was very, very sensitive for this kind of experience. And as I said, she answered with provocation, with, okay, you stare at my breasts, okay, now touch them, and let me see if you dare. And the question is what kind of experience that was for everyone involved. Probably not an erotic experience, something else. Another piece that is interesting in these terms, another piece by Export, is called Genital Panic. Genital Panic, here you see an example. Genital Panic involved Wally Export wearing pants which expose her genitalia. And she wearing these crotch-free pants, which were not so common at the time, are much more easy to get now because a part of erotic fetishism, but at the time handmade by herself. She entered a porno movie theater and went through the rows in order to find a seat. Now imagine, try to remember the last time you were in a cinema sitting there and someone passed you looking for their seat. Then you know more or less what is at the height of your face, right? Here again, she played with it. She went to a porn theater, which was at the time mostly catering for heterosexual men. So this was about people going to the movies in order to watch naked female bodies and specifically female genitalia, because naked female breasts are on display and everywhere and were even more so in the 70s, no problem. You know, if you wanted to see breasts, no problem. But if you wanted to see naked vaginas, okay, you had to go to a porn theater. And she confronted them with a real thing, with a real deal. Like, okay, this is what you want to see. Now look, here it is right in front of your face. She confronted a media reality, the fictional reality of a porn movie with the actual reality of her body. So she was all what body art and performance art is about: physical, immediate, in your face, in the truest sense of the word. But you also have a very, very, this clever approach. This approach of confronting a movie fantasy with a physical reality. I mean, I admire that very much. I think that is an extremely smart idea. And of course, this was not what people wanted. They were quite shocked. One more example from the 70s I have to show you, because it is so interesting and because it has aged so well, is Carolee Schneemann, Interior Scroll. This goes right to the core of the problem. Many performances in the 70s, it was kind of, they had to be naked. People just had to be naked very often for performances in the 70s, somehow. Of course, this plays with the idea that the truth is naked. That is actually a motive from the Renaissance, nuda veritas, the idea that the truth cannot wear clothes because clothes are linked to your status in the world, to your wealth, and so on. And that once everybody is stripped of their worldly status and their ostensible or not so ostensible clothes, then we're all just human. Of course, by now, in the 21st century, we know that that is not true. If you strip a banker and a homeless man of their clothes, they still look different. Because one has led a life of poverty that has left its traces not just on his clothing, but also on his body, and the other has led a life of wealth, which has caused his body to age differently, probably less, and to show different signs of usage, probably. However, at the time, the idea is if you want to get to basic truths, it's better to be naked. So, Carolee Schneemann naked, with the aspect, of course, that if you are a woman artist under 35 and you perform naked, you get more attention. It may not be the attention you want, but you get it. So, Carolee Schneemann, interior scroll, she performed pulling this scroll out of her vagina and reading from it. And this was also a very, this is a seminal performance, quite well known. Everybody who studies art history probably knows this image. And sadly, most people do not know what was written on the scroll. And I didn't know until I saw it. I saw it on display in a collection here in Berlin, in a private collection. And I read the text on the scroll, and the text on the scroll is about Carolee Schneemann, a video artist, talking to a male colleague, another video artist and filmmaker, she's trying to talk to him, she's trying to engage him in a dialogue, and it turns out that he simply cannot hear her. It's not about not listening, he cannot hear her because she is a woman. So an interior scroll, she is reporting an everyday experience of women who are specialists in their field and who try to talk to old-fashioned male colleagues and who are not heard because they are not considered quite as real as the men, and they're not considered as someone who might have something to say or to contribute. So this is an example, a very early example of mansplaining, 20 years before Rebecca Solnit coined the term. Schneemann related an experience of mansplaining, of being talked down to in an area that was actually her area of expertise, of being diminished, of not being taken seriously because people refused to listen to her because she's a woman. And she did not have the term for it. But she pinpointed the experience. What is said about this is that what survived, in my opinion, in my experience, is the image of a young, strong, and beautiful naked Carolee Schneemann, and the text, the real message, has in most instances been lost in the process. One more example. I wanted to give you a more modern example from the 90s because we mentioned it already in our class. This is a shot from Coco Fusco's and Guillermo Gomez Peña's performance piece, Two Undiscovered Amerindians Visit the West from 1992. This is a piece that made Fusco and Gomez Peña very famous. It is a performance where they claim to be natives from some island somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico that had hitherto escaped notice, like one of those famed imaginary Inca hideaways in the Andes or somewhere. So, idea island, Gulf of Mexico, tribe has never been discovered, and they are now being exposed in coast shims, performing rituals and tasks which are being explained by information material. And audience members could interact with them, and for a modest fee, could take a photo of them, or for a little more money, could see them dance. This was a very, very sarcastic piece about colonialism and about the role of scientific institutions in colonialism. No coincidence, we mentioned that piece. I remember that when we talked about the fact that especially in the 19th century, chambers of curiosity could include the display of actual people. People with special needs and special unusual body shapes, or people from outside Europe. under very, very bad conditions. And and all that in the name of science and education. And Coco Fusco and Gomez Peña took that up and transformed it into a wildly hilarious, furious, and angry performance that I think that has set certain standards, and that also is, that is probably very much connected to the political impetus of performance art, introducing a satirical and funny aspect that is rarely found in the early performance pieces of the 60s and 70s, which are so much about existence and deep truths, and they're not normally about fun. Yeah? And they took this up in a very ironic way, which is new, which is probably a thing of the 90s and the 0 years, the aughts. And I think they also introduced these new subjects of post-colonial theory and these questions about colonialism into performance art at a time when that was still quite recent and quite new, and this hadn't been discussed so much. So a groundbreaking piece, refreshing, wildly hilarious and angry, and interesting. Very interesting, and also a good example to close this lecture, because in my opinion, this may contain a lot of the future of performance and where it is going. Go on. Okay, I'm looking forward to our discussion. I'm looking forward to your questions. Forgive me that I brought so many women examples. Of course, an art form that is focused on the body and on a kind of raw violence also produced a lot of very sexual, not erotic, but sexual pieces, a lot of which were misogynistic, even though they're quite impressive. Especially in Vienna, the so-called Viennese action, Wiener Aktion. I thought a lot about whether I should show you these. There are quite impressive artworks there, but I simply cannot stand them. Many of them are so unconsciously misogynistic that they're very hard to bear 40 years later, 50 years later. Yes, so that is the reason for the choice you've seen here. Of course, it's a very limited choice. There is so much to explore in this, by now, huge area, but I hope I was able to give you an introduction and to awaken your interest in this very interesting art form.